Hello. For this inaugural video in my St. Patrick's Day series, we're going to be talking about Damien Goodfellow's graphic novel, Brian Boru, Ireland's Warrior King. So, Brian Boru, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most important figures in Irish history. He was a 10th to 11th century High King of Ireland. He was debatably, at least, the first to really unify the entire island of Ireland under one crown. He was born in the west of Ireland. Supposedly, I don't think historians are real solidly clear on the actual circumstances of his birth, but he was relatively low status. Probably not like a peasant necessarily. He wasn't like a peat farmer or something like this, a turf cutter, something like this. But he was probably of fairly low status within the sort of clan hierarchies of medieval Ireland. But he and his brother defeated a number of sort of local clan chieftains and sort of ascended to, I think Munster was the first sort of major kingdom, major chiefdom that they acquired. Then his brother was killed, and Brian sort of carried on from there, basically just defeating a whole bunch of other Irish clans, including his longtime rivals, the O'Neills, out of what's now Ulster, and various Viking factions, Danes and Norse primarily, Danes and Norwegians primarily, who had invaded Ireland, who had established the city of Dublin. Dublin was basically a Viking city in effect. It was a trade port to the outside world. And much of that trade was done by the Norse. Brian basically fought essentially throughout his entire life. Again, whether that was fighting rival clans, whether that was fighting the Norse, whether that was whoever he was fighting. And in this graphic novel, one of his primary antagonists is actually a woman who would become his wife, Gormla. Gormla was from Leinster. Her brother was king of Leinster. Gormla sort of regarded herself as somewhat independent from any of her various husbands. She's one of those sort of great historical women, like Agrippa in ancient Rome, for instance, who sort of set themselves to the task of ensuring that they have power, and specifically the power to preserve their son's authority. So her son was Cedric. Her oldest son was Cedric. She had other sons. But basically she sort of schemed and tried to align herself with whomever she could, often against Brian, in order to ensure that Cedric would at the very least have control of Dublin after well, not necessarily even after she died. Like, she just wanted Cedric to be in control of Dublin. She felt that was his right. And so much of the graphic novel actually centers on the conflict between Brian and Gormla. That being said, other than Gormla, we don't have much character development in any of the characters here. We get a little bit of a sense of who Brian was, or at least who Goodfellow thinks Brian was. And it's worth remembering that this is Goodfellow's interpretation of Gormla as well. But Gormlin narrates a large portion of the graphic novel. So, I mean, if you open to any sort of random page, I've just picked this page at random, we have the narration, the first bit of narration. We waited for Brian's response to my desertion. We weren't waiting long. Brian sent Mordra into Leinster. Mordra's his oldest son. Immediately, just open a random page and you get narration from Gormla. So we do actually get a good sense of her motivations within the story that Goodfellow is telling. Whether this is historically accurate to her motivations is a different question. This is around... I mean, Brian reigned from 1002 to 1016, I want to say. I may be wrong. Fact check that in the comments. But, I mean, this is early 11th century. Records are sparse. We do not have things like diaries, like personal letters, like anything like that. Any of the kinds of things that historians would now use to reconstruct the inner life of a person. We simply don't have that for figures like Gormla and Brian. And so Goodfellow is interpreting on the basis of what the records say about what Gormla did. She is the main character, ultimately, in that she is the one whose motivations we get. She's the one whose loyalties we see being tested. Her objectives we understand. Brian is this much more nebulous figure. Even though he's literally the title character, he's actually much more nebulous. Like, initially, he starts out, and it seems like he's just sort of fighting for power, but then at some point, it sort of shifts, and it seems like he's fighting for this dream of a united Ireland. And we actually get that sense for the end. Let me see if I can find it. Because, I mean, somewhere, I feel like there was this bit, I don't remember where, where basically it mentions that there was this dream of a united Ireland. 1014, sorry. 1014 is, from 1002 to 1014 is when Brian ruled. Yeah, I can't find the bit that I was thinking of, but I feel like there was a bit where it sort of referred to a united Ireland as Brian's dream. And I'm not 100% sure I think that that's sort of historically accurate. Yes, Brian wanted to and did become sort of overall king of Ireland. It's not necessarily clear that this was a sort of early version of Irish nationalism or something like that. I think this is a medieval Game of Thrones, basically. This is a real life 9th to 10th century, or 10th to 11th century, sorry. A real life 10th to 11th century Game of Thrones. It is about power. It is about getting the throne. It is about establishing security through marriage that creates alliances, about exacting tribute from your liegemen, etc., etc. I think that's primarily what it's about. Yes, Brian did bring peace to Ireland during his reign. by uniting everybody under one overlordship, there were years of peace, which had basically never happened before within living memory. And that was a good thing. I mean, in many ways, that was a good thing. In some sense, Brian Boru, even if this was not his intention, did forge the idea of Ireland as a united nation, of Ireland as a trans-island country that could be unified, could be ruled together. And so in some sense, the Irish nationalists of, say, the Celtic Tiger era, and up through the Easter Uprising, etc., they owe Brian a huge debt in that sense. The idea of Ireland as a nation that should sort of stand on its own united, I think is very much effectively Brian's invention, even if he didn't intend to do that, even if he wasn't thinking in that conceptual way about nationhood. Now, as a graphic novel, it's okay. There's this weird tendency that I've noticed, bearing in mind that I have a very small sample size for this, in Irish history graphic novels, where the authors do seem to assume a good amount of prior knowledge from readers. So I saw this in Jerry Hunt's graphic novels about the Easter Uprising and the Irish Civil War. I see this here in Goodfellow's Brian Boru. There's a lot of stuff that is important or seems important that is just not explained. Characters who we get no sense of their motivation. We don't know who they are, why they're important, what their role is in this story. We have battles that take place here that are not really explained in terms of why they matter. And some of it, I think, is just sort of chaotic fog of war stuff. Like, this is universe building. Let's establish that 10th and 11th century Ireland was a chaotic, violent place with a lot of battles going on, a lot of slaughters of peasants, whatever it is. That's fine as far as it goes. But you have limited page space within a graphic novel. Stuff should matter in some way beyond just random, pointless world building. Not pointless, but random world building. If you're going to depict a battle, it should be important. And it should be clear to readers why it's important. And I think that's one of the things that seems to be missing. And I almost wonder if this is that the Irish school system may do a much better job of teaching Irish history than the US school system does of teaching US history. I mean, that's my frame of reference because I came out of the US public education system. I went to quite a good high school, but nonetheless, US public education system. I teach university. Americans are remarkably bad at knowing US history, understanding US history, let alone world history. So I do wonder if the Irish school system is not actually quite well set up to teach Irish history effectively. And so Irish readers do know who these random people are. They know why these particular battles are important. I don't know. I think that's probably overly optimistic. My suspicion is that Damien Goodfellow, who is very interested in history, I believe, he has a good sense of this material, and so he presents it in a way that makes sense to him, but doesn't necessarily always make sense to readers. The other thing that's, of course, worth talking about is the artistic style. And as far as I can tell, yeah, I mean, the text and the illustrations are by Goodfellow, so this is a unified project. I'm not really in a great position to critique the illustrations because I'm not an art person necessarily, but I mean, this is random fucking whoever guy. This is Kale, Lord of Munster. This is kind of what everybody looks like in the graphic novel. There's this weird, they're like weird, that's Brian and his bard. There are these like weird sort of gaunt, like almost skeletal sort of figures. I don't know. The visual style is very, very odd here. Everybody just looks somewhat bizarre. It looks a little bit like I'd say it looks a little bit like a very sort of dark horror comic, almost. But I don't have really the vocabulary to describe it. It looks like the animation style looks like the illustration style looks like the kind of thing that I would expect to see in a sort of very dark comic, very dark graphic novel about like a serial killer fighting monsters or something like that. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else, but I don't know. It's a very odd illustration style, and because the storyline itself is somewhat difficult to follow, I think that sort of compounds that challenge of understanding clearly what's going on.